Hey everyone. To end this week, I want to build on last week's online lecture on structural oppression. We discussed how all the isms we learned about are not individual biases, but are rather structural. And I want to expand on that idea to define what's called structural racism. This week you learned about global migration on macro, meso, and micro levels. We examined the history of the U.S.-Mexico border and how policies and practices around immigration have helped create and maintain a dual wage system and an exploitable labor force. We also looked at intercultural adaptation in a global capitalist context. The discourses and policies we explored expose something that I want to focus on a bit more today: racism. The history of the U.S.-Mexico border, for example, relied on racialized discourses about Mexican people that helped take the land and exploit labor. Racism is a significant barrier to intercultural praxis, and many people don't have an accurate understanding of what it means. The biggest misconception is that racism is simply a personal bias against people of color. However, as we're going to explore in this lecture, racism is structural. In last week's online lecture, you learned about the 4 components of structural oppression: category formation, internalization, institutionalization, and the linkages of those institutions into a social system. One thing to remember about these 4 components is that they're not a linear process. Rather than thinking of them as steps in a process, think of them as 4 different components that kind of occur simultaneously. That may seem messy, but as we will see next week, structural oppression is a messy system. Racism is a form of structural oppression. It entails the construction of race as a social category. The internalization and normalization of these categories occurs within our institutions, and those institutions link to form a racialized social system. Racism, then, is more complex than an individual prejudice. It is a social system in which people of color are continuously disenfranchised, exploited, and marginalized. It occurs economically, politically, and socially. And although people of color do experience racism on interpersonal levels, it is important to remember that racism is not simply interpersonal. We encounter this idea a lot, news media being one example, and it really hinders our ability to see how racism impacts people of color on a structural level. In this lecture, I'm going to focus on 2 components of structural racism: institutionalized racism and racialized social systems. Racial formation and internalization are important, but they take time to explain, and it would be more effective to discuss them in class. Week 4 on social constructions and socialization will focus on these 2 components of structural racism. Any discussion of racism needs to start here. Racism is institutional. It is not simple hatred of another racial group. It is embedded in the policies and practices of our institutions. Our understanding of race itself, the racialized discourses we have come to normalize as part of the everyday fabric of our social world, come from institutions. What is more, those racialized discourses also shape our discourses, our institutions. So our institutions are simultaneously produce and are produced by race and racism. And when I say institutional, I mean that racism is embedded in every type of institution. More importantly, racism is a form of social stratification. It is a system in which white people can realize their interests and goals at the expense of people of color. That last part is crucial. Racism is a system that, historically and in the present, is carried out on the backs of people of color. This is not a system that oppresses whiteness. It is a system that oppresses people of color. I'll elaborate on this a bit more throughout the next week. Institutions do not exist in isolation from each other. They are linked together to form a social system. And this is what makes racism a racialized social system. Racism is more than one instance of discrimination in one institution. It is how our institutions link together so that people of color experience racism in every institution they encounter. Institutions in all categories influence each other, interact with each other, and overlap. I'm going to provide an example of what I mean by this. But to start, I would like you to, before moving on to the next lecture, which is going to get into that example, complete exercise 3.1.